will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
The 24th of June 2016, the morning after the night before. Against the expectations of the pundits and in a major upset for the political establishment, the EU referendum ended in victory for the Leave campaign. It was a humiliation for David Cameron. It was all so not meant to be like this. Just 13 months before, David Cameron had been triumphant, winning a general election outright against the odds. And just 1 month before, the Queen had come to Parliament in the time-honoured fashion to set out the latest plans of the government. A Conservative government barely into its stride, having completed just the first of its 5 years in office.
Legislation will be introduced to prevent radicalisation. My government will continue work to deliver NHS services over 7 days of the week. Proposals will be brought forward for a British Bill of Rights. In England, further powers will be devolved to directly elected mayors. My government will hold a referendum on membership of the European Union.
Well, some moments there from the state opening of Parliament on May the 18th. Well, at the time, the BBC's deputy political editor was James Landale, and James joins us in the studio now. Welcome to the programme. Now, back then, May the 18th, how do you think Prime Minister David Cameron saw the script continuing at that point?
I think there was a huge sense of expectation that the referendum was about to happen. He was in a holding pattern. Very much the Queen's speech was a holding pattern. There wasn't that much detail in it. One or two nods to his legacy issues of life chances and reforms of schools and prisons, those kind of things that in his head he thought he would have a few years to work on. So he was in that sort of mode. People within Westminster and beyond broadly thought the referendum would be close, but most thought that, Remain would nick it at the end. There was a very clear sense, look, he'd won referendums in the past, he could do it again. He was famous as famously known as the essay crisis Prime Minister, who could always sort of pluck it, victory from defeat at the last minute. And that was the general expectation at the time.
And more from James in a few minutes. The European referendum campaign had been slowly climbing up the nation's political agenda. The Prime Minister had decided in February that the vote on whether Britain stayed in or left the EU would be held in June. Campaign groups had been formed for the Leave and Remain sides, such as Leave.eu and Britain Stronger in Europe. Brexit was the new catchy word for those who wanted to leave the EU. The Remain side never found anything to match it.
So jobs here are dependent on us being in Europe. Have we got the message?
Battle buses started to tour the country to put the arguments to a sceptical public. One message on the Leave campaign bus was certainly to prove controversial. Meanwhile, in Parliament, the former London Mayor Boris Johnson was highlighting to a committee session his distaste for what he saw as interfering rules from the European Union.
And one of the rules that you cite, one of the ludicrous rules, and I quote, is an EU rule that says you can't recycle a tea bag and that children under 8 can't blow up balloons.
The European Commission's own website says that adult supervision is required in the case of the use of uninflated balloons by children under 8. And, I have to say, in my household, I more or less mad only children under 8 are allowed to blow up balloons in my household, Mr. Tari. I do think that it is absolutely ludicrous to have this kind of prescription set out at a European level. Right. At a European level.
I've got the Toy Safety Directive requirements in front of me. It says, warning, children under 8 can choke or suffocate. And it's asking that this warning be placed on the packaging. It's not requiring or forbidding.
It's requiring it to be placed on the packaging.
It's requiring a warning to be placed on the packaging.
You are illustrating exactly what I began the session with again, which is very partial and busking, really, humoresque approach to a very serious question for the UK.
Chancellor George Osborne and his team made a series of claims as part of the campaign to keep Britain in the EU. House values would tumble, holidays would cost more, and the average family would be an astonishingly specific £4,300 worse off.
Businesses like this one, which generate our wealth as a country, would be hard hit.
But should the Chancellor's claims be taken seriously, or are they exaggerated, asked the Treasury Committee.
Interest rates going up, house prices are going to slump, and I'm just wondering whether you're really strengthening or weakening your argument on its own terms by going in for all this stuff.
Well, I actually completely reject what you've said, because the claims on the impact on the economy have been supported by the Bank of England, the OECD, the director of the IMF, and every major credible institution in the world.
Leave campaigners claimed the Whitehall machine was being used against them. One made clear his exasperation when he tackled David Cameron over the use of government websites.
So I think you'll find you cannot keep up that website.
Well, we'll look at our legal advice. We'll respond to your letter.
If this doesn't change, Prime Minister, expect a letter before action, and if we can raise the funds, expect a writ.
Right. Well, there we are.
Moving on, the trade union bill.
Better get back to the office fast then. I was hoping for sort of reasonable. I mean, it seems to me, if taking down a website is a bit like saying you have to sort of remove publications that people might already have from the government or what have you.
That's correct.
So
we'll move on, Prime Minister.
The Leavers stepped up their campaign. There was a particularly abrasive appearance at Parliament by the former Special Advisor Dominic Cummings, a behind-the-scenes figure at Vote Leave.
Will the Vote Leave campaign be setting out their analysis of the macroeconomic impact of leaving the European Union?
We'll be publishing all sorts of things on the macroeconomic impact of leaving, but we won't be publishing these spurious numbers like 4,300.
I've heard of Mr Cummings what you won't be publishing, but what will you be publishing?
We're publishing all sorts of analysis about international trade and how we think things will improve.
Do you not see that leaving Europe puts at risk inward investment from companies like Hitachi?
Heard all the same stuff on the euro. Don't buy it.
If Remainers were keeping the debate focused on economic gloom, Leave campaigners were concentrating on immigration and the huge issue of free movement of labour within the EU area. The arguments were surfacing at PMQs.
Over 200,000 economic migrants came from the European Union in the period for which we've got figures. And yet the propaganda sheet sent out to the British people claims we maintain control of our borders. Have we withdrawn from the free movement of people, or is that sheet simply untrue?
The truth is this: economic migrants that come to the European Union do not have the right to come to the UK. What my right honourable friend has just put forward is classic of the sort of scare story we get. Britain has borders. Britain will keep its borders. We've got the best of both worlds.
And one other moment is worth recalling.
If the British people vote to leave the European Union, will the Prime Minister remain in office to implement their decision?
Yes.
Not exactly borne out by events. 8 days before the crucial vote, the Commons held its own final EU debate.
It is very simple. It is about who governs us. And if we get this wrong, we will not be able to organise and to establish a democracy in this country, which is what the people fought and died for, not in just one world war, but twice.
A former Lib Dem leader feared a Leave victory.
I tell you what will happen. The pound will plummet. Inflation and prices for ordinary people will go up. We will be caught in a whirlwind, an economic whirlwind, which these people irresponsibly want to inflict on millions of our citizens. It is a scandalous position to take.
There are no economic benefits to the UK fishermen from membership of the European Union. Around 92% of fishermen are calling for the UK to leave. I say, let's throw them a lifeline and vote Leave.
It's difficult to see how even the most upbeat Brexiteer couldn't see that we are likely to face months, years, perhaps a decade of confidence-sapping, investment-eroding, job-destroying uncertainty that will take this country back to the dark days of 2008. And I, for one, Mr. Speaker, never want to go there.
Well, less than 24 hours after that debate, the whole referendum campaign came to a shuddering halt.
Reports of a stabbing and shooting involving the MP Jo Cox. Very scant information at this stage, but according to the Press Association...
41-year-old Jo Cox was the first Member of Parliament to be murdered since the assassination of the Conservative Ian Gow at the hands of the IRA in 1990. The public was shocked that the brutal killing of an MP simply going about her constituency could possibly happen in British politics. A 52-year-old man, Thomas Mair, was charged with the murder of Jo Cox. As campaigning stopped for 3 days, Parliament returned for a few hours from its referendum break. Some MPs were grief-stricken. Jo Cox's seat was empty, save for 2 roses, one white, one red. A minute's silence was observed for the murdered MP.
Colleagues, we meet today in heartbreaking sadness, but also in heartfelt solidarity. Any death in such awful circumstances is an outrage and a tragedy.
Her community and the whole country has been united in grief and united in rejecting the well of hatred that killed her. We need, Mr. Speaker, a kinder and gentler politics. This is not a factional or party political point. We all have a responsibility in this House and beyond not to whip up hatred or sow division.
I first met Jo in 2006 in Darfur. She was doing what she was so brilliant at, bravely working in one of the most dangerous parts of the world, fighting for the lives of refugees.
Not long after she had her son, she came to give me one of those regular briefings, and of course the baby came too. And I remember it because she literally didn't stop kissing him all the way through the meeting.
Batley and Spen will go on to elect a new MP.
But no one can replace her mother.
I like to think that it was those deep, strong roots in her own Yorkshire community that enabled Jo to branch her arms around the world with so much love.
I was in awe of Jo. To be honest, I was always a bit envious. She was energetic, she was brave, she was dynamic, she was fit, she was beautiful, she was passionate. I can't ever recall seeing her sad, negative, or without hope. She once told me in a one-to-one meeting at Oxfam as my manager that she didn't do touchy-feely and that I was being too emotional and we needed to get on with it. And we needed to sort out the campaign we were working on.
The public wondered if the shock of the MP's murder might produce a quieter, more considered form of politics as the referendum campaign entered its final days. There was one big TV event to come. The public flocked to London's Wembley Arena for a 2-hour debate. Leading figures in the Leave and Remain camps slugged it out in front of jubilant supporters.
The Britain that I love works with its friends and neighbours. It doesn't walk away from them.
And if we vote Leave and take back control, I believe that this Thursday can be our country's Independence Day.
Referendum Day, the 23rd of June, was marked by flash flooding and torrential rain, a portent perhaps of the drama to come. The polls closed at 10 p.m. The counting started. The BBC's results programme got underway. 1.5 hours in, political editor Laura Koonsberg noticed something about the voting trends in one of the places likely to declare early, Sunderland.
2 different sources suggesting to me that Sunderland, which is going to be one of the other early results, that we expect to be for Leave, might be very, very clearly for Leave.
Bit by bit, the first indications were confirmed. The night's story was going only one way.
The total number of votes cast in favour of Leave was 82,000.
We'll find out as the results go in, but my goodness, Newcastle and Sunderland, David, don't anyone go to bed yet.
But certainly a lot of traders who thought that Remain had had a very, very good night are now selling out of sterling as quickly as they can.
But the truth is that so far, at least, we've had many more places where Leave are doing better than expected
than where Remain are doing better than expected.
So that's very good for Leave. They're winning in a place where Remain were expected to win.
We do have to face the possibility, no more than a possibility, that Leave will win this referendum and that Britain will leave the European Union.
We have to face up to the fact that large parts of the country are actually turning away from both of the main parties.
You could see South East, North West, Yorkshire and the Humber, North East, West Midlands, East of England, East Midlands and Wales all going for Leave.
In the small hours, Nigel Farage of UKIP, the man who devoted years of his life to fighting the EU, was triumphant.
This will be a victory for real people, a victory for ordinary people.
As dawn broke, the game was up for the Remain camp. Victory lay with Leave.
The British people have spoken and the answer is we're out.
For many, it was a bemusing moment. Britain had opted for the exit doors, but the sense of bewilderment was only added to shortly after 8 a.m. outside 10 Downing Street.
I was absolutely clear about my belief that Britain is stronger, safer and better off inside the European Union. But the British people have made a very clear decision to take a different path. And as such, I think the country requires fresh leadership to take it in this direction. I will do everything I can as Prime Minister to steady the ship over the coming weeks and months. But I do not think it would be right for me to try to be the captain that steers our country to its next destination.
So David Cameron there with that dramatic resignation announcement. James Landale is with me once again. How much of a thunderbolt was it, do you think, the EU referendum result?
Oh, it was a huge shock. I think there'd always been some doubt. And I spoke to somebody who had gone for a long walk with David Cameron the weekend before the referendum, and David Cameron at the time said, look, I genuinely don't know which way this is going to go. So though I think there was a realisation that it was going to be tight, but I think in their heart of hearts they thought that they would always win. And so therefore to lose and to lose as convincingly as they did was a huge shock to the government. This was not how the script was supposed to go.
And of course, the conventional wisdom of referendums is that governments only call them when they believe they can win them, and also that the don't knows, the floating voters, always swing in behind the status quo at the end. In other words, they vote Remain.
2 points to that. One is David Cameron was forced to call this referendum some time ago, well before the last general election, and he was forced to do so, in his mind, to see off the threat from UKIP and also to maintain Conservative Party unity. Because if he hadn't promised this referendum, there's a strong chance, many people believe, that Tories would have divided and fought amongst themselves and would have been less likely to win the election. Also, in terms of those floating voters and the fact that most people tend to swing to the status quo in referendums, that is true of most referendums, but not European Union referendums. If you look at all the other referendums that have happened in other countries, in France, in Denmark and Ireland, towards the end there has always been a swing to the Eurosceptic cause, and that seems to have been one of the things that happened here.
Do you think David Cameron had any option at all not to go ahead and have this referendum?
I think it would have been very, very difficult for him. This is one of those issues that, if you think about it, has been dividing British politics and British voters for many, many years. There was a sense that it was coming to a head, that at some point the British people had to be given a chance to express their own views on it in a fundamental binary way. This was just the moment that it happened. I think it would have been very, very difficult for David Cameron not to do it. Other people say, well, you know, OK, have the referendum, but he could have campaigned in a different way. But that's a different story.
He looked quite sombre at that point. Was he a sad man, do you think, at that point, on the 24th of June?
Regretful, I think. I think this is not how he wanted it to go, and he was being forced out of Downing Street with a slight lack of the decorum that he would have liked. But on the other hand, many people thought, look, you know, this is the way British democracy works. There's been an extraordinary vote by the people, obviously not in a general election here, but he took the view that, you know, he had not got the confidence of the people. He had to go quicker than expected. Famously, he told me before the election that he wanted to serve a full second term. Well, it certainly wasn't to be.
James, thanks very much. We'll talk again in a few moments. Well, both sides spent the weekend after the referendum result recovering from the shock of the Leave victory. The Commons then regrouped on Monday afternoon.
The British people have voted to leave the European Union. It was not the result I wanted, nor the outcome that I believe is best for the country I love. But there can be no doubt about the result. Although leaving the EU was not the path I recommended, I am the first to praise our incredible strengths as a country. As we proceed with implementing this decision and facing the challenges that it will undoubtedly bring, I believe we should hold fast to a vision of Britain that wants to be respected abroad, tolerant at home, engaged in the world, and working with our international partners to advance the prosperity and security of our nation for generations to come.
Jeremy Corbyn criticised the way the referendum was fought.
Half-truths and untruths were told, many of which key Leave figures spent the weekend distancing themselves from, not least the claim that the vote to leave would hand the NHS an extra £350 million per week.
In Scotland, Mr. Speaker, we voted to remain because we are a European nation. And it really matters to us that we live in an outward-looking country, not a diminished Little Britain. In Scotland, we are now being told from Westminster that despite the majority against leave, we're going to have to do as we're told. We're going to be taken out of Europe against our will.
The voters of the United Kingdom have demonstrated the value of that great principle, the principle of democracy, for which people fought and died.
I can accept defeat, but I will not give up. I have not changed my beliefs.
Leaving aside the constitutional turmoil, the damage to the economy and the uncertainty that hangs over Britain's place in the world, the leaders of the Brexit campaign have engendered an atmosphere where some people believe it is open season now for racism and xenophobia.
Could I ask him also to say today and to condemn very clearly those people who are almost implying that decent people all over this country who voted to leave the European Union are somehow closet racists?
Will the Prime Minister agree with me that when he says the country needs to come together, and he's right to do so, does he accept that the first part of that is that everybody has got to accept the result of the referendum, whether they like it or not?
The mood in the Lords at the Leave victory was far from celebratory.
The campaign is over, we're now in a new phase. That it would be no bad thing if the campaigning organisations on both sides, and I speak as somebody who took a prominent part in one of them, should shut up shop.
My Lords, as a Democrat, I respect the outcome of Thursday's referendum, but I also suspect that, like many colleagues across the House, I am profoundly saddened by the result. I have a deep anxiety about what the future holds for our country.
Whatever the result of this referendum and our decision to leave the European Union, this country has not given up on its values. You know, we are still the United Kingdom, and our values remain exactly as they were.
On Friday morning, I woke not only with a song in my heart, but also with the words of the Magnificat in my heart. That is, he hath put down the mighty from their seat, and he hath exalted the humble and the meek.
A few days later came the verdict of the Archbishop of Canterbury.
The course of the campaign was both robust, as it properly should be on such great issues, but at times veered over the line on both sides. It's not merely being robust, but being unacceptable. And through those comments were created cracks in the thin crust of the politeness and tolerance of our society, through which, since the referendum, we have seen an outwelling of poison and hatred that I cannot remember in this country for very many years.
And how about this verdict from a former Cabinet Secretary?
After 65 years of public service, I do not remember such an unholy mess as we are in now, except perhaps after the Suez affair. It is an existential as well as a political crisis.
As David Cameron argued that matters were now out of his hands, Remain campaigners in Labour were getting agitated.
We know that many millions of people in this country felt they were deceived by the exaggerations and the lies in the campaigns of both parties, and they now feel themselves cheated by that result, and millions of people have protested. Isn't it right that we look again at the possibility of a second referendum in the certainty that all second thoughts are always superior to first thought?
It wasn't just in the Commons where the calls came for a second referendum. The Lords joined in as well.
In the interests of democracy, the British people must be given the chance to vote on the deal to leave the EU once we finally know what that deal is and what that deal costs.
Dear God, wasn't one enough? Do we really want another one? I can't believe that people would want another one.
And soon after that, it was confirmed that a parliamentary debate would be held on the issue of a second EU referendum in early September. There was a curious party political symmetry in the weeks immediately after the referendum. Uniquely, there was serious leadership turmoil in both the Conservatives, as candidates jostled to replace David Cameron, and the Labour Party. The apparent half-hearted support for the Remain campaign by the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn led to the extraordinary spectacle of, firstly, a motion of no confidence in his leadership being passed by his MPs, and then a deliberate series of resignations by the majority of Mr Corbyn's front bench team. It was all designed to force the Labour leader out.
Keep Corbyn! Keep Corbyn!
But, battered and embattled, Jeremy Corbyn refused to resign and was in defiant mood at Prime Minister's questions.
The Prime Minister has 2 months left. Will he leave a one-nation legacy? And will that one-nation legacy be the scrapping of the bedroom tax, the banning of zero-hours contracts and cancelling of the cuts to universal credit?
And I have to say to the honourable gentleman, he talks about job insecurity and my 2 months to go. It might be in my party's interest for him to sit there. It's not in the national interest. And I would say, for heaven's sake, man, go.
With shadow cabinet members resigning, David Cameron stepped up the mockery as he welcomed the newest MP, Rosina Allen Khan, to the Commons.
We welcome the new member for Tooting to her place. I think I'd advise her to keep her mobile phone on. She might be in the shadow cabinet by the end of the day.
But the Conservatives couldn't afford to gloat too much. They had their own leadership difficulties. Candidates came forward as potential prime ministers. One declared herself like this.
My pitch is very simple. I'm Theresa May and I think I'm the best person to be Prime Minister of this country.
There was huge interest in whether the former London mayor, the always lively Boris Johnson, would win the top job. But in an act of pure Westminster drama, Boris Johnson was knifed politically by this man, the Justice Secretary Michael Gove.
What he did not have was the capacity to build and to lead that team and to provide the leadership the country needs at this critical moment.
The loss of support from former ally Mr Gove and his followers led to the shock withdrawal from the contest to be leader of the Conservative Party.
And in view of the circumstances in Parliament, I have concluded that person cannot be me.
Boris supporters were despondent. When the majority of Conservative MPs turned against Mr Gove, that left just one Leave campaigner in the leadership contest, this woman, Andrea Leadsom. And everyone expected a 9-week battle between herself and Theresa May. Then came Andrea Leadsom's interview in the Times newspaper, and one more twist in the tale.
I am therefore withdrawing from the leadership election.
Which left Theresa May to have what's known in Westminster language as a coronation. She became Britain's 54th Prime Minister without a contest. So, without a word of understatement, a huge amount of fallout from the EU referendum result. James Landale is with me once again. It seemed to be a little bit curious that there wasn't any celebration for Leave. In fact, some of the key figures in Leave, Michael Gove, Nigel Farage, actually left. They didn't seize the initiative at all.
There's an old saying that revolutions tend to eat their own children, and I think many people have seen that's what happened to the Leave campaign. Remember, some members of the Leave campaign didn't think they would win, particularly some of the, those people who thought they might be in with a chance of the leadership. They thought they might be, establishing positions for themselves, showing that they'd had a good fight, a good campaign, so they could present themselves in other leadership ways. And when it actually happened, there was a sense of, oh, crikey, we've actually got to deal with this now. And one of the great criticisms that was made of the Leave campaign was that they had said, you know, we want to leave the European Union, but they'd never been entirely clear about what actually happens next. What's the nature of the relationship that the British government should forge with the European Union, with countries outside of the European Union? You know, what did it actually mean? And so at that point, there was a sense of hiatus rather than celebration of victory. I think, yes, there was victory, celebration they won the campaign, but instantly it turned into, certainly within the Conservative Party, a battle about who is now going to lead this party. Because everybody knew David Cameron was going, therefore the leadership campaign got underway. And that took any kind of precedent over, right, what does this mean for Britain?
And extraordinary that there should be two parallel outbursts of leadership turmoil. Has that ever happened before?
I think it's pretty rare, but if you think about it, both were forced by the result. David Cameron announced resignation because of his defeat, and also Jeremy Corbyn's perceived lack of enthusiasm for the Remain campaign was one of the triggers that convinced his opponents within the Labour Party, within the Parliamentary Party, that they had to get rid of. Now they had to act. Here was a moment where they had a pretext, a reason to say, look, you know, to the Labour Party, we were all in favour of remaining in the EU. Jeremy Corbyn was lacklustre in their view in the way he campaigned. This is why we cannot carry on with him as leader, because, you know, he's one of the factors, perhaps, that many Labour voters didn't come out to support the Remain campaign. They chose to were more attracted to a sort of more UKIP-style message. And so I think that triggered the Labour leadership contest as much as it did on the Conservative side.
James, thanks. 9 years ago, Tony Blair left the job of Prime Minister in the grand style, with applause ringing out from all sides in the Commons at the end of a Prime Minister's question time that was more relaxed than normal. The idea obviously appealed to David Cameron as he worked out how to bring to a close his tenure of the top job. Wednesday, the 13th of July, saw his 182nd and final PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. Other than one meeting this afternoon with Her Majesty the Queen, the diary for the rest of my day is remarkably light.
That in 33 years in this House, watching 5 Prime Ministers and several ex-Prime Ministers, I've seen him achieve a mastery of that dispatch box unparalleled in my time.
This session does have some admirers around the world. I remember when I did his job and I met Mayor Bloomberg in New York and we walked down the street and everyone knew Mike Bloomberg and everyone came up and said, Mayor, you're doing a great job. No one had a clue who I was until eventually someone said, hey, Cameron, Prime Minister's Questions, we love your show.
Mr. Speaker, it's only right that after 6 years as Prime Minister, we thank the Right Honourable Member for Witney for his service. I've often disagreed with him.
Jeremy Corbyn praised remarks recently made by Theresa May.
Isn't she right that too many people in too many places in Britain feel their economy has been destroyed in towns they're in because the industries have gone, there are levels of high unemployment or underemployment and a deep sense of malaise?
And to be accused of sloth in delivery by the right honourable gentleman, let's just take the last week. We both have been having these leadership elections. We got on with it. We've had resignation, nomination, competition and coronation. They haven't even decided what the rules are yet. Got into power, it'd take about a year to work out who would sit where.
Jeremy Corbyn! Democracy is an exciting and splendid thing, and I'm enjoying every moment of it. The Home Secretary, Mr. Speaker, I was talking of the economy. The Home Secretary, again, she said, many people find themselves exploited by unscrupulous bosses. I can't imagine who she's referring to.
Let me say something to him about the democratic process of leadership elections, because I did say a couple of weeks ago that I thought it was, I have to say, I'm beginning to admire his tenacity. He is reminding me of the Black Knight in Monty Python's Holy Grail. He's been kicked so many times, but he says, keep going, it's only a flesh wound. I admire that.
Mr. Kenneth Clarke.
Can I ask that, as no doubt he will have some plans for a slightly more enjoyable and relaxed Wednesday morning and lunchtime, nevertheless, he will still be an active participant in this House as it faces a large number of problems over the next few years. As no two people know what Brexit means at the moment, we need his advice and his statesmanship as much as we ever have.
But I will watch these exchanges from the backbenches. I will miss the roar of the crowd. I will miss the barbs from the opposition. But I will be willing you on. And when I say willing you on, I don't just mean willing on the new Prime Minister at this dispatch box, or indeed just willing on the front bench defending the manifesto that I helped to put together. But I mean willing all of you on, because people come here with huge passion for the issues they care about. They come here with great love for the constituencies that they represent. And also willing on this place, because yes, we can be pretty tough and test and challenge our leaders, perhaps more than some other countries, but that is something we should be proud of, and we should keep at it. And I hope you will all keep at it, and I will will you on as you do. The last thing I'd say is that you can achieve a lot of things in politics. You can get a lot of things done. And that, in the end, the public service, the national interest, that is what it's all about. Nothing is really impossible if you put your mind to it. After all, as I once said, I was the future once.
And with that ovation ringing in his ears, David Cameron returned for the final time to Downing Street, re-emerging a few hours later with family to say a few words to the waiting media, posing with wife Samantha and children on the Downing Street steps for those final photographs, before making a car journey to Buckingham Palace to tender his formal resignation to Her Majesty the Queen. He'd been Prime Minister for 6 years and 2 months. Moments later, his successor, Theresa May, made her way to Buckingham Palace, where she was invited to form an administration. The Queen appointed her Prime Minister and First Lord of the Treasury. Returning from the palace, she spoke for the first time as PM.
Her Majesty the Queen has asked me to form a new government, and I accepted. We are living through an important moment in our country's history. Following the referendum, we face a time of great national change.
So, Theresa May replacing David Cameron as Britain's Prime Minister. James Landale here once again. I know it's early days, but how will history record the record of Prime Minister David Cameron?
One word, Brexit. However much you would like that to be something else, that'll be the word that hangs around him forever. He will be the Prime Minister who called the referendum and lost it, and as a result, the United Kingdom left the European Union. However it pans out in the future, and whatever may happen, and we don't know, that is something that happened on his watch. And yes, the second paragraph will say, here's a man who made the Conservative Party electable again, who brought the Conservative Party together, who partially won one election, and then against all the odds won outright a second general election and won a clear mandate from the British people, who was a man very good at being Prime Minister. Even his opponents would concede that he was good at doing the prime ministerial thing, whether it was giving statements on grave matters such as the Savile inquiry into Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland, but also negotiating with, he looked the part on the world stage. And he did introduce, some reforms. People will look at some of the education reforms that he's brought in, the academies that he's brought forward, the development of that whole agenda. There will be those bits of sort of Cameroonism that will linger within the body politic. But once they've said, yes, he won a referendum to keep the United Kingdom together, they will come back to this is a man who, on his watch, saw the United Kingdom leave the European Union.
James, thanks very much indeed. 13 years have passed since this happened. the invasion of Iraq by US and UK forces to destroy the regime of Saddam Hussein. The arguments have raged ever since into the rights and wrongs of the war in Iraq and the subsequent events. The report of the inquiry by Sir John Chilcot had been long anticipated. It ran to an extraordinary 12 volumes and some 2.5 million words. Although its findings were strong, it didn't have the huge impact originally envisaged. Chilcot concluded there had been a rush to war without peaceful options looked at, and there had been too little planning for the post-invasion period. MPs responded to the inquiry report.
The decision to invade Iraq in 2003 on the basis of what the Chilcot report calls, and I quote, flawed intelligence about the weapons of mass destruction has had a far-reaching impact on us all. It's led to a fundamental breakdown in trust in politics and in our institutions of government. The tragedy is that while the governing class got it so horrifically wrong, many of our people actually got it right.
The lack of planning has also been evident since in relation to Afghanistan, to Libya, to Syria, and most recently, with absolutely no plan whatsoever in regards to Brexit.
The then Prime Minister must take full responsibility for encouraging this House to take the decision that it did with disastrous consequences in destabilising the world.
The horrors of Saddam Hussein, what he did to his own people in Halabja and elsewhere, were clearly documented, and I think we were right to take part in that invasion.
Parts of the Ministry of Defence, including the Chiefs of Staff, were not delivering the advice that the government needed, and elements of the Foreign Office had succumbed to a form of groupthink that leaves me deeply concerned as to the structure and advice governments can get.
Whatever we think about the judgment that was made, we should acknowledge that the bond of trust between the government, this House, and the public has been damaged by the decision that was taken in 2003. And we here in this place today now have an absolute need to put that right for the future.
And in the Lords, opinions differed about Tony Blair.
I have never believed that he lied to the British people. And I accept that he was sincere in believing that military action to remove Saddam Hussein was necessary as a last resort.
To coin his own phrase, it's right that Tony Blair should feel the hand of history on his shoulder.
If I was back in the same place, he said, with the same information, I would take the same decision. If that is left to stand unchallenged, Chilcot will have failed. Let's be quite clear about that. That statement is unacceptable.
Those of us who've had top secret intelligence files put in front of us, it's tremendously seductive. You want to believe it. You think you're extremely privileged to have access to this information. And then you need some wiser old heads around who can actually say, well, there may be a few other considerations that one needs to take into account.
When Theresa May selected her lineup of ministers, the changes were extensive and bold, not to say brutal. After 24 hours of comings and goings in Downing Street, virtually every job in the cabinet lay in new hands. The appointment of Boris Johnson as Britain's new Foreign Secretary caused a mild sensation. There was a new Chancellor, new Home Secretary, new Justice Secretary. In fact, there was newness everywhere. But some of the issues in the new Prime Minister's in-tray were long-standing ones, like the big decision on whether to go ahead with a £31 billion programme to replace the fleet of Trident nuclear submarines. Theresa May came to the Commons.
I call the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, there is no greater responsibility as Prime Minister than ensuring the safety and security of our people. That is why I have made it my first duty in this House to move today's motion, so we can get on with the job of renewing an essential part of our national security for generations to come.
If keeping and renewing our nuclear weapons is so vital to our national security and our safety, then does she accept the logic of that position must be that every other single country must seek to acquire nuclear weapons? And does she really think the world would be a safer place if it did? Our nuclear weapons are driving proliferation, not the opposite.
No, I don't accept that at all. And I have to say to the Honourable Lady that sadly she and some members of the Labour Party seem to be the first to defend the country's enemies and the last to actually accept the capabilities that we need.
But can we cut to the chase? Is she personally prepared to authorise a nuclear strike that could kill 100,000 innocent men, women and children?
Yes. And I have to say to the honourable gentleman, the whole point of a deterrent is that our enemies need to know that we would be prepared to use it. Unlike some suggestions that we could have a nuclear deterrent but not actually be willing to use it, which came to come from the Labour Party front bench.
Jeremy Corbyn welcomed the new Prime Minister.
I wish her well in that position, and I'm glad that her election was quick and short. We on these benches, despite our differences on some issues, have always argued for the aim of a nuclear-free world. We might differ on how it's going to be achieved, but we're united in our commitment to that end.
Last year, Party Conference voted overwhelmingly in favour of maintenance of the nuclear deterrent. Yeah. So why aren't we hearing a defence of the government's motion from the dispatch box now?
Party policy is also to review our policies. That is why we have reviews.
It is obscene that the priority of this government, and sadly too many people on the Labour benches, at a time of Tory austerity and economic uncertainty following the EU referendum, is to spend billions of pounds on outdated nuclear weapons that we do not want, do not need and could never use.
And in the end, the Commons backed the renewal of the Trident nuclear weapons system by a massive majority of 355 votes. 60% of Labour MPs supported renewal, so going against the views of their leader, Jeremy Corbyn, and underlining the deep split in Labour's ranks. So a strong Commons start for Theresa May, and a couple of days later, she was in her place for her first Prime Minister's Question Time as PM. Interest was considerable.
Order. Questions to the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that the whole House will wish to join me in welcoming today's employment figures, which show employment at another record high.
Her government is already missing its targets on debt, deficit, welfare cap and productivity. 6 years of government austerity has failed. The long-term economic plan is clearly dead. Is there a new one?
No, it's the long-term economic plan that has actually delivered the record level of employment that we see today. He talks about austerity. I call it living within our means. He talks about austerity, but actually it's about not saddling our children and grandchildren with significant debts to come.
In her speech on the steps of Downing Street, she also addressed insecure workers, saying you have a job, but you don't always have job security. Does that mean that she's proposing to scrap the employment tribunal fees, repeal the Trade Union Act, or ban zero-hours contract, as more than a dozen European nations have already done? That would help to give greater job security to many very worried people in this country.
I'm interested that he refers to the situation of some workers who might have some job insecurity and potentially unscrupulous bosses. I suspect that there are many members on the opposition benches who might be familiar with an unscrupulous boss. A boss who doesn't listen to his workers, a boss who requires some of his workers to double their workload, a boss, and maybe even a boss who exploits the rules to further his own career. Remind him of anybody.
Theresa May doing her first Prime Minister's Questions. Well, James Landale is with me once again. A remarkable clear-out of ministers and officials by Theresa May, obviously stamping her own authority and making it clear she's not going to be just Cameron 2.0.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she has made a very, very clear statement that, the Cameron era is over. And I think that, from my judgment, most people think that that was probably a sensible decision. Yes, it's difficult because you store up a lot of, unhappiness on the back benches. The Cameroons now will be sat there on the back benches watching everything she does. And to a certain extent, they will hold her to her words that she uttered in Downing Street, that the words of one nation conservatism, of helping the poor, of bringing on people, all of this sort of moderate centrist, some might say, sort of positioning itself to take a few clothes off the Labour Party. The Cameron team on the backbenches, I think, will hold her to that and say, look, you promised this, you promised that, and if she doesn't deliver, they will pick her up on it. So I think that's the risk she was always going to take. But I think she made a very, very clear strategic decision. You can't just, for example, lose Cameron and keep Osborne, as had been suggested, that keep George Osborne on maybe as Foreign Secretary, well known in the international community, a bit of continuity from that's the argument. She took the view, no, Team Cameron have to go, and she was quite ruthless, not just at the top, but also at the bottom of the government, of taking out the Cameroons and saying, no, it's my team's turn.
What's it going to be like for British ministers when they negotiate the whole British withdrawal from the European Union, when they negotiate that with their counterparts in Europe?
It's going to be very, very hard indeed. For a start, we're not used to this whole process. Nobody knows how this is going to operate. If you think about it, it's down to sort of nitty-gritty. Like, if we, for example, leave the European Union, what are the regulations that are going to have to apply to our farmers over the way they milk cows, over the way they spray their crops with various chemicals? What protections that are currently European do we, the UK government, reinstate? What about all those subsidies for farmers? Do we, repeat the same amount, or does, farming subsidy just join the long list of queues for all the other government financial priorities? That's just one small thing. If you think about all the regulations for businesses, it's hugely technical. Thousands and thousands of EU regulations are going to have to be looked at, and they have to be thought over, and the British government and the British civil service is going to say, do we keep that, do we amend it, or do we ditch it entirely? And that is a process that is going to take years.
James Landell, thanks very much indeed for joining us on Westminster in Review.
Thank you.
Once again, Parliament's committees have had a lively term, probing issues and shining light in dark places. But the witnesses have not always been rushing to face the MPs. Mike Ashley is the man at the top of Sports Direct. It was alleged the sportswear firm forced many of its employees to accept low rates of pay and to work in a harsh regime. Mr. Ashley initially refused to come to Westminster to answer MPs' questions. When he finally did come, the businessman argued that Sports Direct had become too big to manage.
I didn't build Sports Direct. Sports Direct built me. You understand? It's like going out one day and you've got a tiny little inflatable and you're in control, and the next you wake up one morning and you're on an oil tanker. Yeah. And that oil tanker, you can't be all over that oil tanker. And if there is a problem on that oil tanker, by the way, you're still responsible, as I ultimately am always responsible for Sports Direct. I am aware of that.
Lots of organisations have grown and given employees permanent contracts. Why is it so difficult for you?
I have given a lot of people permanent contracts. You're not being fair now. Now you're not being fair. You're trying to twist what I'm saying. And that's not fair. And that's why I fear coming to things like this, because you're trying to put words in my mouth and you're trying to twist what I'm saying. I am telling you it was physically impossible over the last 10 years to have done what we've had to do at Shirebrook with that amount of people unless we went to external agencies who were professionals. So you have to accept the internet growth was a phenomenon that none of us could have allowed for. And you have to accept, or I have to accept, not you, sorry, that Sports Direct have made some mistakes. You have to accept that as well. So we have to look to the future. I've offered you guys to come. I've offered you guys to come any time you want now. I've even offered to come back in a year if you really want me to. And let's do some measures. And I won't have them all right. Impossible. Impossible I can get everything right. I'm one human being.
The businessman was then asked about British Home Stores. The famous high street store had collapsed in April with debts in excess of £1.25 billion.
Did you want to buy BHS?
Again, I don't think it's unfair. I think it's a no comment as it is now. Yeah.
Okay, well, that's fine. Mr. Ashley, thank you very much for your time.
I can't resist it. 100%. I wanted to buy BHS.
You wanted to buy BHS?
Okay. Now I'm going to get told off by everybody.
Oh my God.
Sorry.
And why was that? And why was that stopped?
Thank you. This is very kind.
No, I can't. Ian, please. I'm already. That's why I'm not city trained. That's why they say they can't house train me. Because I just am that person. You ask me something, I blurt out the answer. You'll ask me another one, and we'll keep going.
Well, 8 days after that performance by Mike Ashley, a retailer with an even bigger reputation was in the hot seat. Like Mr. Ashley, Sir Philip Green, the former owner of the now collapsed British Home Stores, had also been reluctant to go through a Westminster interrogation. Why, in 2015, had Sir Philip sold BHS to the racing driver Dominic Chappelle, a man who in recent years had been declared bankrupt at least twice?
Look, whether we got misled, whether we got duped, unfortunately, there seems to be, a lot of people that accepted this guy at face value, right? Lawyers, accountants, all sorts of other people happy to take shares in his company, banks prepared to write letters, whether they're good or not, right? These are the facts. Now, unfortunately, sadly, it was the wrong owner. We could keep going over. You said you don't want to be here all day. True. You'd be here for the rest of your life. Would I do that deal again? No.
But I'm just trying to.
Sorry we did it. Yes.
And on to the idea of selling BHS to Sports Direct.
You did nothing to stop the process to ensure that Sports Direct could be given more time to consider this.
Stop what, sir?
Stop the deal.
Which one?
The deal to buy BHS.
Look, let me just ask a sensible question to your whole committee. Based on everything we spent 5 or 6 hours, on what possible basis would I want to stop somebody buying it if they would rescue it? Why?
Ego.
Oh, please. I mean, come on. That's an insult.
No,
that's
it's not.
Really, that's really rude.
No, it's a case of,
Well, I find that really rude.
Well, I do apologise because I don't mean to be rude, but in terms of human nature...
I think we got to hear...
You couldn't make a success of it.
Excuse me.
You couldn't make a success of it, and you didn't want another retail billionaire to do the same. Would it be that?
I'm glad the meeting's ending. I think that's disgusting, and it's a sad way to end.
Well, we haven't finished yet, Sir Philip, if that's OK. We've got just a number of...
Yeah, but I think that's out of order. And I think you should apologise. Here's a business where if there's a bona fide buyer, I have offered to add to his purchase price for free, to put X million pounds in on top of what he wanted to pay. And I'm trying to block it. I mean, it's laughable. It's laughable. And I think you should owe me an apology for that. I've sat here 6 hours, I haven't been rude to you, and I think that I'm owed an apology. Got nothing to do with any ego.
Sir Philip Green. Well, politics isn't what it used to be. The country's got a woman Prime Minister for the second time. There are 8 members of the Cabinet who are women, and females are in key positions in the devolved legislatures, with 3 of the political parties in Scotland led by women, Northern Ireland led by the DUP's Arlene Foster, and in Wales, Plaid Cymru led by Leanne Wood. These days, male election victories are newsworthy events. When peers voted to choose their next Speaker, the winner was, hold the front page, a man, the former Cabinet Minister, Norman Fowler.
I'd like to thank the House very sincerely for the exceptional support that they have given me, and to say that I will do my utmost to live up to this trust.
What we've seen today is a parliamentary first. This is the first time a man has been elected to the role of Lord Speaker.
Lady Smith reflecting on an unlikely glass ceiling being smashed. And that's it. Parliament is now in recess after a busy and momentous term. MPs and peers are scheduled to return to Westminster on Monday, September the 5th. Parliament will be kept busy throughout the autumn, debating the issues resulting from Brexit. Some interesting times are lying ahead. But for now, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.